Right, yeah, hey everybody. I'd love to introduce Miguel Lurgi from Swansea University, and he's been studying and modeling the dynamics of ecological systems and their, well, chaotic behavior, as the picture shows. Welcome, Miguel.
Cool. Thank you very much, Greg. So yeah, as Greg said, I am at Swansea University in the computational ecology lab. If you guys are interested in the kind of things we are doing there, I put here my the website for the lab. There are other resources there and things because obviously today I'm gonna talk about just a fraction of the kind of things that we are doing. So yeah, for today's talk, I want to start with a brief background on the kind of things that, the motivation for this work. What are the research questions I am interested in? Yeah, by doing that, I will kind of set the scene for 3 examples that I want to talk to you about today, on how we have been using different modeling approaches to, in the first instance, understand the role of space and a mixture of interaction types in community stability. Then we are gonna touch a little bit on a model we did to answer questions related to synergistic effects between warming and invasions on food webs. And then at the end, some recent work on how we are thinking of incorporating evolutionary process into the ecology to create kind of eco-evolutionary dynamics for ecosystems assembly, right? So yeah, basically, I am actually a computer scientist or engineering by training. I did my degree in Venezuela. I only became like an ecologist later on when I did my PhD. And the whole point of my main motivation to start doing that research was and still is to some extent is to understand how systems, in our case ecological systems that might look like random collections of many species, actually have some degree of order, right? Like they can be put together in structures that look like this, that at first glance might look even more complex than the picture on the left. But the interesting thing about these kind of objects, networks that I'm guessing all of you guys are familiar with, it's that we can quantify things on this stuff, right? And we can count the number of links, count the connectants, count distributions of degrees, stuff that sort of allows to also compare differences across these types of communities based on these structures. And in ecological, the importance of this is that since around the 70s or 60s, there has been a lot of work showing how the structure of these interactions or these networks actually affect critical properties of the ecosystem and stability in particular, right? So ecologists are, at least the branch of theoretical ecology is very interested in the stability of these systems in terms of how would they respond to perturbations, right? So there is a lot of linear stability analysis and the kind of the type of things related to matrix operations, like obtaining the Jacobian, the Lyapunov exponents and things like that, to understand how robust or how stable are these systems, right? And then once we have a good understanding of how this system works, these systems work, I am interested in using these kind of predictive approaches to try to get a better idea of how they will react to different types of perturbations, right? Like obviously, the obvious anthropogenic, environmental related perturbations are warming, invasions, extinctions. We have done also some stuff on habitat loss, these kind of things. Environmental perturbations that affect the community and the structure of the network, and how that could change properties of the ecosystem, right? So that's kind of, you know, the broad thing I am interested in. And in my lab, we try to tackle these things using a mixed approach involving the development of theoretical models using ecological theory and computational ecology, traditionally using models like, for example, the Lotka-Volterra type of things, network analysis, and also spatial dynamics in the sense of like meta communities and things like that. So that on one hand, and then on the other hand, gathering large scale data sets of networks of species interactions and analyzing those from, you know, statistically, right? So this is just an example of some data from a paper a few years ago on the latitudinal variation of the structure of trophic interactions, the food webs in intertidal communities. So we take data like this and from many other types of systems, even microbial systems, and we try to analyze these patterns and relate them to mechanistic models, to try and say things about how they are assembled and how they will react to perturbations. So in today's talk, I am mostly going to focus on the left-hand side here, given the audience. And, you know, when I spoke to Greg, the main interest here was to model dynamics and to show a little bit the kind of modeling approaches we use for this. But yeah, I do to some extent a fair bit of research also on that right-hand side of things. So if you're interested in those kind of things, feel free to get in touch after the talk. So yeah, the first thing I wanted to talk about was or is about how we have used a modeling approach to better understand the role of a space and a mixture of interaction types in the assembly of complex or species interactions networks. I realized that maybe in ecology we use the word complex for networks that perhaps in your view are relatively small, because we never talk about, you know, more than you know, a few hundred or you know, maybe 1,000 at most species. And for you guys, you probably are talking about like millions of nodes. So yeah, just bear with me in terms of terminology. I don't really mean super big things, right? So yeah, the main questions in this project were basically how do spatial dynamics and different types of ecological interactions affect the stability of food webs? I guess that I should give a little bit of context here. So in ecology, people looking at networks of species interactions, they usually look at specific types separately. So there is a lot of work on food webs. There is a lot of plant-animal mutualistic interactions, which are bipartite networks in which one level is plants and another level is animals that pollinate them. Then some other people look at host-parasite interactions. But recently, there has been a surge of research in trying to mix these interactions together, right? So here, and that's why here we were trying to look at, or one of the interests or the focus is the incorporation of different interaction types in the same system. And then as a follow-up question, using the same kind of modeling approach, how we could use that spatial model to better understand the effect of habitat loss on these networks, right? So essentially the model sort of works like this. This is just a cartoon representation of the network that we used. We actually used around like 60 species, so it's a bit bigger than this network here, but this is just to illustrate that we had you know, these 6 different types of species or guilds, right? So we had top predators, primary producers, mutualistic animals and mutualistic plants, and herbivores and plants that did not benefit from mutualistic interactions. And then based on these sort of interactions between species, we define local level rules between individuals. So this is an individual-based model. in which individuals lived in a in a grid basically. Um, and here I am just exemplifying the trajectories of two potential individuals, like the black one and the dark gray one, that eventually meet after following some random walk. And then when they meet, the rules of interaction based on the network, so the outcome of that interaction is determined by, like, for example, who eats whom or who exchanges mutualistic rewards with whom, right? And then they go on and live around the world and reproduce, and eventually, the dynamics sort of settle and become stable, right? So the outcome of this, of incorporating, so that using this model, we actually explore different values of mutualistic interactions, which is shown here in the x-axis. So this MAI ratio means mutualistic to antagonistic interactions ratio. So the higher this number, the more mutualistic interactions there were in the system. And basically adding mutualistic interaction actually increase the abundance of the community in general, right? Which was kind of expected because mutualistic interactions sort of are beneficial for everyone. But it was an interesting result to see that this was coming up. More interestingly, perhaps, is the fact that quantitative generality, which is a measure of, it's actually quantified, quantitative measure of how many interaction partners his species has, actually decreased, right? And this was kind of surprising because, when you had more individuals, we expected interactions to be, more common and equally likely to happen. But it turns out that more individuals meant that species tended to interact more closely with specific partners. So they were more specialized, these species, right? And trying to dig a little bit deeper into the mechanisms for why this might happen, we looked at the distribution of the interaction strengths, right? So in this plot, this shows the distributions of the strengths of the interactions. Well, the y-axis is obviously the frequency, and then my ratio again is basically how many mutualistic interactions you have. And you can see here a nice pattern of distributions shifting towards the left, right? Meaning that more mutualistic interactions and more abundance of species translated into a species actually interacting in a weaker way, right? So interactions were getting weaker, and at the same time, the spatial aspect of things meant that species were forming like clusters of populations, right? So it basically meant, and this we quantified using a typical sort of metric for used in landscape ecology for quantifying the clustering of patches in a landscape, which is the Moran's eye. As the ratio of mutualistic to antagonistic interactions increased, also the clustering of species across different trophic levels, from plants all the way to top predators, also increased. So this meant that these kind of clusters of populations were forming in different parts of the landscape, and this created a situation in which the interactions were more specialized and at the same time weaker. And this facilitated basically the stability of the communities. So that was something that we published, actually is relatively old now. But then the interesting part, when after we had that model, we wanted to basically see what would happen to this ecosystem when you applied habitat loss. And we simulated habitat loss by removing like entire parts of the landscape. So in this picture here, the red cells symbolize habitat that was lost, meaning that individuals could not live there any longer. So if they were moving in the green part and they were trying to cross to the other side, they couldn't. Basically, they were stuck into the patches of good habitat. And in ecological, in ecology, or in, I guess, restoration or conservation, one thing that is kind of really, like really current is the debate between what is better, to protect really big patches of habitat or protect only many small patches that are distributed randomly in the landscape, right? So we tried to answer the question of whether losing habitat in a random way was really different than losing habitat in like chunks, basically. And we used that model to run many simulations and discovered that in terms of community composition, so like how many individuals belong to each of the species we had, the way in which habitat is lost impacts the community really differently, right? So in this ordination plot, there are two. So we had a multidimensional space of several species with many individuals, and we use a PCA type of approach to project that into 2 dimensions. And this is these points are colored by the type of habitat loss. So the purple is contiguous habitat loss, so big chunks of patch of habitat were lost. Then intermediate is really small clusters of relatively big patches lost. And then finally random is random cells from all over the landscape being lost. But the number of cells lost in each of the scenarios was the same across the tree, right? So the amount of area lost was the same, but the way in which it was distributed was different. And it turns out that it has it makes a lot of difference in terms of the composition of the community. So we wanted to dig a little deeper into what could be the mechanisms behind these differences. And basically, we looked at 2 things that are usually related or linked to ecosystem stability, which is the coefficient of variation of populations, which in these plots is plotted in the y-axis, and also the interaction, the strength of the interaction between species, which in the top row is also on the y-axis, but on the left-hand side, and in the bottom row is on the x-axis, right? So I'm not gonna talk you through each of these panels, but I just wanted to show you how the trends of decrease or change of, for example, interaction strengths or population across different gradients of habitat loss. So from 0 loss all the way to 90% of habitat that was lost, actually changes qualitatively from a random loss scenario to a contiguous scenario, right? So it makes a lot of difference to lose habitat randomly in the grid cell, in the grid, than in a continuous way. And this meant that basically communities that were in which habitat loss was random were actually becoming a little bit more stable as habitat was lost, whereas contiguous loss makes community less stable. So the coefficient of the variation of populations was higher, right? The reason why...
Question.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. That was going to be asking about the good reason.
Sorry. What
No,
was...
go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to clarify that the reason why ecologists are interested in the coefficient of variation in the temporal series of the number of individuals is because it gives you a way of quantifying the stability of that time series, basically. So this is what we are seeing here. But yeah, go ahead with the question.
Question is the drivers of this. So the way I'm kind of visualizing it, from my prior knowledge, is that if you take out a whole contiguous chunk or separate 2 communities, you really mess up an ecology. Whereas if you leave connective tissue, like protection, sea protection areas, if you connect them up together, the animals can cross, or you build a highway and you build a bridge across the highway for the animals to cross, the impact is much lower. Is
Yeah.
that the equation for random versus contiguous?
Yeah, that kind of, you could think of it like that, but maybe the scenario you are talking about is closer to the intermediate one, because you have several clusters of relatively large patches, right? So you are splitting the populations, and then whereas the contiguous, there is still a single big population, but it has to live in a smaller area, basically, right?
Right.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, the other interesting thing is that, I'm sure you can see here how the colors are reversed across this line, right? Which means that there was a reversal in the relationship between the strength of the interactions and the population. So this relationship is always expected to be like that. So like a positive relationship. The stronger the interactions, the less stable the systems are. So there are more fluctuations in the populations because they interact more strongly. So you have this signal. But the unexpected part is that the red dots here are habitat loss. Large losses of habitat. So more than 40% of the landscape. And the blue dots are fractions of loss that are smaller than 40%. So relatively smaller loss of habitat, right? So the interesting thing here is that this trend was reversed between random and contiguous, right? So in contiguous habitat loss, the largest the habitat was lost, the less stable the communities were. Whereas in the random scenario, it was the other way around, right? And this is also connected to the question you asked, because if you have a random loss scenario, but you are losing relatively few cells, then you still have some degree of connectivity, right? Whereas in the contiguous, as soon as you start losing habitat, you are still constrained to a single habitat patch. So to actually test or look into this idea, we looked at how much of the landscape the individuals are able to explore under the three different scenarios, right? So in here, the colors are the different types of loss, and the black paths are trajectories of individuals in those respective habitats. And you can see that individuals in random scenarios are less able to explore the landscape compared to those in contiguous scenarios, right? So the individuals, obviously, because everything is connected, and this is the reason why the strength of the interactions is higher in large losses of contiguous habitat loss, because the individuals can explore more of the environment, and because of that affect other species more strongly, right? So this is like kind of the interesting sort of low level mechanistic explanation of what was happening in those things. And yeah, that was kind of
maybe my intuitions are wrong. You're saying that the more habitat is lost, if it's contiguous, you have, because you're saying 90% habitat lost, and it's a tiny patch is left, and they're exploring it more.
But they are able to explore more of that, what is left.
But I'm surprised by that, because I'm seeing 90% intermediate. I would imagine would be like a web, or should I be thinking that it's a disconnected web by the time it gets to 90%? Or at least 50%. I would have expected a lot of tendrils connecting the various regions, so a lot of alleyways.
Yeah, no, in here there are, so in the cluster, in the intermediate scenario, there is some connectivity, but it's not like great. Whereas in here, the agent is able to move, all of this and all of this, basically.
Maybe, tell me if I got, maybe the situation is right. The distance of a reasonable path from one place to another is shorter in contiguous than intermediate and random. So the exploration actually happens in that case.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way actually. Yeah.
Because I imagine
Yeah,
it's going to be graph
maybe.
connected, but like really windy. It's, even if they are connected.
Well, the percentage of landscape that is being explored here is not, it's quantified as the number of cell or the fraction of cells that are habitable that have been visited. So
Hmm.
it's not about, you know, uh, even if you, because the difference between these lines essentially happens because an agent in here, for example, it can't move to the lost part, so it kind of gets stuck in the same places, right? So maybe, the path, if you were able to find a path, could be
Hmm.
shorter, but the problem is that you are kind of surrounded by bad things, and it's hard to find that path that will take you to the other location. That's what it's happening
Yeah,
in the
this
same.
actually smells a lot like the original like Google PageRank algorithm, which is the link structure of the web. It's not that you can't click from one place to the other to find some website. It's that usually you don't, because literally we're just taking paths through the web connectivity graph,
Yeah.
and they were finding which things are more hubby, more connectable. And it sounds like you're discovering that patchy disconnection networks mean that people, well, individuals just don't go places because they're too difficult.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's
Okay,
what's
makes
happening.
sense. Thank
Yeah,
you.
it is that. Yeah, I hadn't realized the connection with the page rank, but that's interesting. Yeah, cool. So yeah, now I want to switch gears a little bit, both in modeling approach and question addressed. So here we looked at the synergistic effects of two things: invasions and warming on food webs, right? So basically, we first wanted to know if there is a way in which we can predict the effect of invasions, and also whether invasive species will invade using properties of the network and also using traits of the species. Um, and then as a follow-up, what would be, once we understand these effects of invasions, how would warming modulate these effects, basically? So the way we did this is we took a model that is traditionally used in ecology to model dynamics in networks. It's a kind of bioenergetically allometrically scaled model in which the rate of change of species in the basal level, so plants and so on, is governed by a logistic growth term, which is this. So they have an intrinsic growth. They don't need to have resources to survive, as long as this R is positive, right? So they are continuously growing. And they lose biomass via this term, which basically comes or is the connection between plants and consumers, right? So the equation for the consumers is the one at the top, and the first term is essentially the equivalent to the second, or the counterpart of the second term in the basal resource equation. And then they also have consumers can also be consumed by further higher consumers, which is the second term of this equation. And then lastly, there is like a metabolic or death rate for consumers, right? So there is biomass that is lost from the system with a certain rate that is constant. So usually for those of you not familiar with this type of models, there are like different functional forms for this F here, which is basically the function that determines how what is the shape of the interaction, right? So for example, the traditional Lotka-Volterra ones were uh, uh, linear responses. So this F is simply a coefficient, but we use a more kind of sophisticated or a more complicated functional form in which predators only consume prey until some some level. They cannot consume prey indefinitely, because otherwise the nodes will keep taking resources from the others without ever saturating, right? So in here, this functional form introduced like a saturation point at which species saturate in abundance once they have reached the, which is based on all the interactions they have with all of the other species. So using this model, this is how, this is a rule of change. We model temporal dynamics of each of the nodes in the network that look pretty much like the top graph here, right? So we assemble a network at the beginning, or we draw a random network at the beginning, which then, well, it's not really a random network. It's a network generated by a model that we in ecology is normally used to generate networks with the structure of a food web, right? If you guys are interested in this, I can give you more details, but it's a model that ecologists normally use to generate networks with a specific shape that looks more or less like this one here, right? So using that network, we let the dynamics run for some time. And then once the initial transient dynamics have lapsed, then we look at the network there and introduce an invasive species, which is here symbolized by this green node. And then after the invasion event happens, we allow for the dynamics to run again, and then we look at the network at the end of the simulation, right? So, and we basically contrast the structure of these two networks before and after the invasion using a set of network properties that are commonly used to analyze food webs: the connectance, the links for species, the mid food chain length, fraction of different types of species, etc. I'm not going to bother you with all the details of these quantities, but you can think of this set of properties as statistical descriptors that we use to quantify the structure of the network, basically. So using this framework, basically, we analyze the outcomes of thousands of simulations and looked at the relationship between different aspects of the network structure and the success of the invasive species, right? So it turns out that connectance, so the connectivity between the nodes, it's a fairly good predictor of invasion success. So networks that were less connected actually allowed for less invasive species. The length of the food chains, like the distance between basal resources or plants to top predators, was also a good predictor of invasion success, with shorter food chains actually deterring invasive species. And the same thing for a couple of other metrics. But the important thing is that, we identify these things that can be used to predict how a node will, the likelihood that a node will invade the network, right? A new species invading the network. And then in terms of the effects of the invasive species, we looked at the stability of the community, both at the community and the population level, in terms of the variability of the biomass through time. And we saw that depending on the connectance of the network, the stability of the community was achieved earlier or later in the simulation time, right? So basically what these results show is that the connectivity of the network it's a good way of predicting what would be the effects of an invasive species on the stability of the network. So with invasive species on networks that are more connected, causing more havoc at the community level, but less so at the population level, right? So the whole community was fluctuating way more in communities that were more connected when they were invaded. Cool.
Actually, can you clarify that? What's the difference between community and population? What scales
Yeah.
are we talking about?
Yeah. So population, let's imagine in here that we have, like 60 species, for example, right? And for each of those species, we have one of these lines, one of the abundances lines, right? And this temporal series, obviously, we have 60 of those lines, and we quantify the coefficient of the difference in population between the from time step to time step. So the coefficient of variation across time windows, right? And we can do that either per population, so for each species individually, which would be the population biomass stability, or we can sum up all the signals together and have a metric for the fluctuation of the entire community, right? So if you imagine that you collapse all of these lines into a single line by summing up at each time step, then that would be the community biomass stability, basically. Yeah. So when you have, for example, you could have situations in which, like in a simple two-species system, a predator-prey, in which the dynamics are not synchronized, you could have a high population variation because the populations are doing like fluctuating a lot. But then when you sum both species together, the community as a whole would look like very stable, right? So that is.
So if I may interpret this, it sounds like you're going to have some kind of extinction events where one species is replaced by another one disrupted. But if one is disrupted, the other one moves in pretty quickly to that niche. So at a larger scale, there's no difference.
That's a good question. A larger scale, there is no difference. Well, yeah, I guess that would be true if you were able to ensure that a species that was lost
Mm-hmm.
will have the same connections to other species and therefore influence those species in the same way that the species that was lost was influencing them, right? Because if you
Yeah.
yeah
And then there would be no effect. But that's a hard one. So let's see. So you're saying that you have when you have a single species, the bottom,
yeah
if it's more connected, it's more impacted, right?
yes yeah
Okay, and therefore, I guess I can see it having many avenues for impact. Well, I guess I'm not exactly sure what happens because I can see more avenues for impact, more connections to disrupt, or more connections means more resilient connections. But I guess here you're thinking of I need all my neighbors, not I need any of my neighbors. That's the kind of interactions you're modeling, fair?
yeah exactly yeah
But then if I have a community of many species that are interconnected, I am more resilient. And I guess interconnections there, I'm reading as one can be replaced by others. Yeah, like there's two scavenger species. So if there's one that's gone, the other one's still there. That would be my addition of a community level
yeah
connectivity. Is that
I
right?
would yeah that would be the way that I would probably interpret the bottom panel, yeah, because when you have more connections, then when the network is more connected, this is connectivity of the network, not of the node. So when the
Mhm.
network is more connected, then the the fluctuations of the biomasses are covered or are influenced by many more things, right? So like losing a few connections or one species or even several species, but in general will probably have less of an effect at the community level because you have like more like you have more redundant paths going places, basically. Yeah.
Okay, so this depends on the network being kind of the nodes having an and behavior that I need all my neighbors. So the way I'm reading this is this result is valid for when networks are modeled as requirements. I need all my neighbors, and therefore, if any of them fail, I can't eat them. They can't eat me, or I also get destabilized. Then each individual species is heavily impacted.
Yeah.
But at a higher level, you have alternate paths. You have many different ways of achieving the same role in the network. right? So therefore that's resilient. And for this to happen, the species would have to be, their role in the network has to be mostly like Andy, like you need all your neighbors. Is that like multiple paths? I think that's pretty solid. That's kind of unambiguous. Different species really are different from each other. They're complementary. They're independent. Whereas each species, where is this true, I guess, and where is it not true? That I have one food source. No, I have several food sources and I need them all. As
Yeah,
opposed to I need several food sources and I need at least 30% of them to survive. That would be a very different kind of network.
yeah. Or the other more extreme scenario would be when connectance is bigger, then predators in general have many more food sources. So removing one doesn't make a lot of a difference, right?
That's an obvious or.
Yeah,
So that's probably the one extension you can try, that you have
yeah,
more like behavior or some complementarity kind of things.
yeah,
And it'll be that's somewhat, and then it would be like then you get results that it depends on the species feeding behavior. Obviously, it's again then your equation starts getting really messy. Unfortunately,
yeah, yeah.
it becomes a lot more region based. All right, cool. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So yeah, once we had this, we wanted to see what happened, if you add warming. So one way in which people doing these kind of models incorporate temperature dependence into these models is by taking the vital rates of the species, so the intrinsic growth rate, the carrying capacities, the death rates, the attack rates, and the handling times, which are these the ones highlighted here with orange, and they make them dependent on temperature based on this equation, which is kind of taken from the Arrhenius equation for temperature dependency, right? And these m's here are actually body sizes, so they also depend. These things are functions of the temperature, but also of body sizes, right? So the reasoning for this being that temperature affects the vital rate of species differently depending on their body size, right? And this is something that has been shown in ecological studies, because smaller animals tend to do everything faster. So increases in temperature are expected to basically make that metabolism to run faster and things like that. So it's related to the metabolic theory of ecology. But anyway, that is how we include these terms here. And basically, by running experiments similar to what I explained before, we started the system at different temperatures, waited for the transient dynamics to happen, and then introduce a species. And this is what happens here. So in the x-axis, we have different temperature scenarios from 0 degrees to 40 degrees. And the invasion success, or in other words, the fraction of invaded networks, actually decreased with temperature, right? So it was harder. It was harder to invade in warmer climates. One of the reasons for this is the fact that there are more species that are being lost. So part of the effect of this, or part of this temperature effect, is that it's harder to invade communities that are simpler. So that was one of the things. Then the warming did not only have an effect on the success of the invasive, but it also had an effect on the effects that the invasive species had on the network. So warmer networks actually lost more species. And it also lost more interactions, right? So as warming increases, we should expect food webs to lose more species when they are invaded. And then finally, we looked at the effect on different network or interesting network properties across a gradient of temperature, right? So in this particular case, we compared the length of food chains, the average length of paths between basal species and top predators. for different levels of warming. So the red dots here are very warm communities, and the blue and purple dots are very are colder communities. And what we see here is that in you know, when you start increasing the temperature from cold to a little bit warm but not that warm, the drop in these kind of things is higher, right? So basically, the lesson we learned here is that at least for mid food chain length, increasing temperature when you are in a colder region, it's actually much more impactful than invasions across when the habitats are already warm, right? Which means that basically we should be more cautious when perturbing ecosystems that are still in, you know, in their original environments, basically. Because once they are warm enough, then, you know, the effects are not that different from a few more degrees of temperature increase. Cool. I don't know if I have enough time for the last part, because I realized I am conscious of time. So I don't know if you want me to go ahead with this last bit, or you want.
We can just maybe move faster, but yeah, just getting some idea of this would be fantastic.
Yeah. So some work that we have been doing recently, which is currently on bioRxiv, is try to incorporate some evolutionary mechanisms into an ecological setting to understand how species level selection increase persistence, and how are evolutionary dynamics modulated by competition and environmental perturbations, with the final goal of trying to understand the trade-off between critical and effective competition as the main focus of selection in plant-animal mutualistic communities. So I'm gonna go relatively quick to here. So the network in this case is a bipartite network, in which the lower level you can think of as plants, and the top level as animals that pollinate them. The model is very similar to the one from the previous part, but in here we have another term, because we have the mutualistic term, which is similar to, you know, the other functional response. But additionally, so this term is modeling the dynamics of these links from level to level, but we also have an extra term which models competition between species within the same level. So there is intra-level competition, right? So there are two types of interactions: intra-level competition and then inter-level mutualism. And then the way, so that is the ecological setting, and the way in which we incorporated evolution was by basically applying random mutations on the links between the species. So these random mutations were based on two probabilities. The first probability, P, basically changes, determines whether we are going to do a swap of interactions, in which case a link is randomly chosen from the network and is changed from one species to a different one. So for example, in here, this link was changed to be this one, right? So this species rewired one of its interactions to a different species, and that is a swap. The 1 minus P probability would result in either of two other events, which are also governed by an extra probability term, Q, that we call Q. So with probability Q, there is a loss of a random link. And with probability 1 minus Q, there is a creation of a new link, right? So in this case, this link wasn't present, and then randomly we chose two partners that were not connected, and we create a link between them. And the interaction strength for all of the links is drawn from this normal distribution. So because we were interested in understanding the interplay between competition and environmental perturbation on the evolutionary dynamics, we varied two parameters in this model. The first parameter was this intraspecific competition term. So this term of the equation is being varied across all of these different values. And we also varied the growth rate of the species, like using a small perturbation to it, right? So this small perturbation reflects or tries to simulate environmental perturbations on the intrinsic growth rates of species. So what we found is that in here, in all the plots that I'm going to show from now on, the orange color shows scenarios where selection was enforced. Sorry, I should probably have been more specific. So when we apply the mutation or the random change on the network, we run the dynamics again, and we evaluate whether the biomass of the species that was subject of change increased or not, right? If it increased, then we allowed for the change, and we called that scenario selection, because the change, the mutation is only accepted if it's beneficial for the species. If it's not beneficial, then we discard that change, right? And then we had another baseline scenario in which all mutations were accepted regardless. So in the results here, the orange elements in the plots are going to be the selection scenario, and the blue ones are the non-selection scenario, in which all mutations were accepted regardless of the outcome, right? So one important thing here is that to highlight is that across different scenarios of environmental perturbations and also of intraspecific competition, selection was always better at enhancing diversity. This final alpha diversity here is just a measure of the number of species that we had in the system, and selection always performed better than scenarios with no selection. But importantly, the perturbation that we apply on the growth rates of the species had a strong impact on the number of species, right? With larger perturbations, especially for high levels of competition, being very detrimental for ecosystem persistence. So we wanted to explore a little bit deeper what could be what we could we learn from that, and we calculated a measure of how stable communities are ecologically, which is called the critical environmental perturbation. This is a quantity that basically that can be calculated analytically over the equations to determine how likely it is that a species will be lost under a perturbation. And this is kind of the central result here, because we show that the ecological stability of the system, which is again quantified by this critical environmental perturbation threshold, it's a very good predictor of how many species you will end up with in the evolutionary dynamics of the system, right? So it means that networks that were more robust in terms of their resistance to perturbations will harbor more species in evolutionary longer timescales. So yeah, this is kind of the main result here. I had a couple of extra slides for further stuff, but I think that yeah, you guys are probably tired of me talking. So I will leave it at that. But yeah, if you have any other questions or you want to catch up later, just please feel free to get in touch. I am always keen to discuss these kind of things with anyone. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Let me just ask one question to kind of connect this to like the rest of the ecological work. So you have simulations that are done with parameterization. So you choose the parameters to kind of elucidate the dynamics. How can you start connecting these to real ecosystems? Like what kind of parameters would you have to measure by a real ecosystem to model that particular one? Like coral reefs in the Caribbean, which is warming, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so I guess the the short answer is that it's very challenging to parameterize these models with any kind of empirical data. There are some of the parameters of these models that have been tested in, like, for example, when we did in the example of the temperature dependence, the shape of the curves that are used to to change the values of the growth rates or the metabolic rates or the attack rates based on temperature, those have been inferred from empirical data, some of those relationships, right? So it is, for most of these parameters, is at the broad scale kind of macroecological level, when you have a good understanding of how ecosystems behave in general, and you can use that information to parameterize these models. For the ones in which we explore usually several values of, for example, in the last example here, we do that usually because there is not a lot of information from empirical evidence to fill up that gap, right? So it's very hard, especially in systems that are larger than 2 species or a handful, to quantify stuff like, for example, direct competition between species. This is like a really hard thing to do. So the other side of that is that for some systems, so I have also done some modeling work on smaller systems, like 5 or 6 species, for which there is enough temporal data of species abundances that you can actually calculate some of these parameters, right? Like, for example, the growth rates, the interaction coefficients, and stuff like that. So for some simpler systems, it is possible still, but still really challenging to basically fully inform the model using parameters from that have been inferred from data. So yeah, it's a mixture of things, I guess. It's the answer to this. Yeah.
So it makes sense. And for these simple systems, are these approaches applicable to like biomanufacturing? I'm thinking growing algae, which have only a few species of the algae, and the predators that can attack them, because that causes the collapse of the facility.
Yeah.
Or same thing for bacteria, which produce chemicals. There may be more than one species, or bacteria eating various things. Is that scale tractable?
Yeah. That it has been done actually. Recently, there have been a series of papers in the last 3 or 5 years in which people are basically manipulating explicitly in the lab communities of up to 6 bacterial species or microbial species, and they have been actually very successful at parameterizing models like these ones.
Mm-hmm.
Especially Lotka Volterra, with even just simple linear functional responses to basically predict the final outcome of this assembly of a handful of species communities. So yeah, in bacterial species, in bacterial communities of a handful of species, definitely it is something that is actually very current, and a lot of people are doing this thing and are very interesting. And in larger animals, the typical examples from like the lynx and hare that come from back in the day, and some other more recent, more contemporary examples of like 2 species. Those are also, and the example I was talking about before, when I in my postdoc in Australia, I was looking at 5 species: the kangaroo, dingo, small native mammal, rabbit, and the fox, and they have a lot of data on these things that can be used to parameterize. Long data of temporal series of all of these species. So this data has been used to parameterize models like this as well. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. It's very valuable.
Cool. No, thank you very much for inviting me. That was really nice. Yeah.